Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood in silence, at the center of the most powerful courtroom in the United States. 9 justices sat above her, and Judge Samuel Alito was ready to make an example out of her. She was accused of contempt for daring to speak out against injustice. Why? Because she dared to speak, dared to question a decision that she believed would hurt millions of children and families across this country. He threatened to send her to prison, right there, in front of a packed courtroom. But what she said next turned a courtroom into chaos. She pulled out a 15-page legal defense she wrote herself, and what happened next changed everything. And for the first time, even Judge Samuel Alito's voice began to tremble. This isn't just a courtroom battle. It's a story about justice, race, and what happens when one voice refuses to be silenced. And to better understand this story, we have to go back to where it all began. The alarm buzzed at exactly 6:03 a.m., and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett groaned, swiping blindly across her nightstand until her fingers landed on her phone. Her voicemail light blinked red. One new message. She pressed play while still half asleep, and her aunt's southern drawl crackled through the speaker. "Try not to go to jail today, baby, but if you do, at least wear a nice blazer." Jasmine chuckled through a yawn. "Thanks for the vote of confidence, Aunt Lila," she mumbled. She shuffled to the kitchen, wearing mismatched slippers and last night's campaign t-shirt, only to find that her toast was burnt on one side and soggy on the other. The coffee maker sputtered like it needed life support, and when she reached under her couch for her go-to black heels, she pulled out 2 left shoes. "Seriously?" she sighed, tossing one across the room and grabbing a dusty backup pair from the hallway closet. As she walked past the mirror, her blouse caught the edge of her coffee cup, leaving a streak of brown across her chest. She looked down at the stain, paused, and muttered to herself, "Perfect. Off to challenge the justice system, looking like I challenged a latte." Even her cat, Marshall, named after Thurgood, seemed uneasy that morning. He paced near the door, meowing like he sensed something off. Jasmine paused, frowning. There was something different in the air. The normal morning rush had a strange silence beneath it, like the world was holding its breath. She brushed it off, scratched behind Marshall's ears, and stepped out, humming the tune to an old gospel hymn her mother used to sing when the house was tense. "This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine." When she arrived at her Capitol Hill office, Jasmine didn't even get a chance to remove her coat before her assistant Kenny poked his head in with wide eyes. "Congresswoman, you have a visitor. He says he's from the U.S. Marshal Service." Jasmine blinked halfway into her office. "A marshal? For me?" Kenny nodded slowly, clearly nervous. Moments later, a federal officer entered, tall and tight-lipped, holding a sealed cream-colored envelope. "You've been summoned, ma'am," he said, extending the document with 2 hands. Jasmine accepted it with a furrowed brow, flipping it over carefully, as if the paper might burn her fingers. The seal was unmistakable. Supreme Court of the United States. Her heart skipped. She opened it and read the first line out loud. "Notice of proceedings, statements made against judicial ruling in Fairfield v. Department of Education." She looked up, stunned. "They're really trying to jail me." "For speaking?" The room fell completely silent. Her aide stopped typing. Kenny slowly sat down. Jasmine read the rest. A formal contempt hearing scheduled within 72 hours. She had publicly criticized a recent 5-4 Supreme Court ruling that gutted federal oversight on state education standards, calling it a betrayal of civil rights precedent. She'd said exactly what she felt. Live at the White House podium, this court substituted personal ideology for constitutional principle. It was a bold statement, and now apparently a criminal one. "This is real," Jasmine whispered, holding the paper tighter. "They're not just offended. They're coming for me." Her press secretary's face went pale. "What do we do?" Jasmine stared out the window, watching reporters gather outside. Her voice was low, deliberate. "We do what they never expect. We don't flinch." Across town, inside the high-walled marble sanctum of the Supreme Court, the air was cold and reverent. Judge Samuel Alito sat at the head of the chamber, his hands folded tightly around a manila folder filled with printed transcripts. He flipped through them slowly, as if savoring each word like a prosecutor lining up a conviction. Jasmine's press conference quotes were underlined, highlighted, and annotated with red ink. "This wasn't criticism," he said flatly. "It was defiance, calculated and public." He looked at his fellow justices, most of whom sat in silence. "She disrespected this court, and we are not a reality show. I want her in front of us by Friday." One of the younger clerks hesitated. "Justice Alito, respectfully, there's very little precedent for summoning a sitting member of Congress for contempt over a public statement, especially without prior warning or a formal judicial reprimand." Alito didn't flinch. "If we wait for precedent, we allow the erosion of this court's dignity. It ends now." Another justice, Justice Rivera, spoke quietly. "There are political implications. The media, let them talk," Alito snapped. "We need to remind America that this court still means something." But even as he spoke, unease rippled through the chamber. Because what the court feared wasn't just a rebellious congresswoman, it was the uncomfortable truth that her words had already touched a nerve across the nation. She was young, black, fearless, and unapologetically sharp. She wasn't just a critic, she was a symbol. In that moment, none of them fully realized what they had done. They hadn't silenced Jasmine Crockett. They had summoned her. And by Friday, they would all learn what it meant to stand across from a woman who knew exactly how dangerous truth could be when spoken by someone who refused to be afraid. By mid-afternoon, Jasmine's office had transformed into a pressure cooker. Staffers paced between whiteboards and cluttered coffee tables. Legal memos stacked high alongside half-empty Red Bull cans. On the center table sat the Supreme Court summons, untouched since morning, as if it carried radiation. Jasmine stood at the window, arms crossed, watching a growing number of press vans park across the street. Inside the room, no one knew quite how to begin, until her Deputy Chief of Staff, Will, broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Okay, hear me out," he said, leaning forward with mock seriousness. "We could just fake a fainting spell. Right at the courtroom door, full collapse, EMTs, gurney, media frenzy, boom, no hearing." A few chuckles broke out. Even Jasmine cracked a smile. "We'd need a pretty dramatic fall," she said dryly, "and an Oscar nomination." But the laughter didn't last. Kenny cleared his throat and pointed to the document. "This isn't just some symbolic slap on the wrist. They're summoning you to stand before the highest court in the country, with criminal implications. This isn't a hearing, Jasmine. It's a trap." Everyone fell quiet again. They all knew what this was. A show of force from an institution uncomfortable with being publicly challenged. Jasmine had struck a nerve, and now they wanted to make an example of her. But it wasn't just her freedom at stake. It was the message they were trying to send to every bold voice who might follow in her footsteps. Jasmine finally turned from the window, her tone calm but heavy. "So we're clear, if they succeed in jailing me, no other congressperson will dare challenge them again. Not in public, not with substance." She paused. "They don't want an apology, they want obedience." Later that evening, her senior counsel briefed the team on the ruling at the heart of the storm. Fairfield versus Department of Education, a 5-4 decision that gutted decades of federal protections for historically underfunded schools. The ruling gave individual states near-complete autonomy over education funding, effectively ending federal oversight in areas that once ensured basic standards for low-income districts. For civil rights advocates, it was a rollback of everything Brown v. Evers Board had fought to establish. During a televised press briefing, Jasmine had said with sharp clarity, "This court just spit on 70 years of precedent. It's not judicial restraint, it's abandonment of constitutional responsibility." That sentence, those exact words, were now the basis of a contempt allegation. Not because they were false, but because they were too true. She hadn't accused the court of a crime, she had accused it of cowardice. And that, for men like Judge Alito, was apparently worse. Her staff had pulled up the headlines. Some praised her honesty, Others labeled it reckless. But deep in the legal fine print, a warning had emerged. By attacking the court's logic and motives, Jasmine had placed herself in direct violation of what some justices believed was a boundary: the unwritten rule that elected officials must never question the integrity of the judiciary. She hadn't broken a law, she had broken decorum. And now they wanted to see if they could punish her for it. The phone rang at 9:46 p.m. Jasmine had just slipped off her shoes and was microwaving leftover takeout when her assistant appeared in the doorway. "It's the president." She took the call in her study, lights dim, eyes fixed on the glowing skyline outside. His voice came through warm, familiar but hesitant. "Jasmine," he said, "I've been briefed. This is complicated. We're not in a constitutional crisis yet, but we're tiptoeing close." She didn't respond immediately. He continued, gently but firmly. "My advice? Issue a statement, something neutral. Clarify your words, emphasize respect for the court. Don't escalate this. Just apologize and move on." Jasmine closed her eyes and took a slow breath. Then softly she replied, "With respect, Mr. President, if I back down now, what message do I send to the next black girl who wants to run for office? That if she speaks too boldly, she'll be dragged into a courtroom and threatened with prison? That she can't challenge the most powerful people in the country unless she whispers?" There was silence on the other end, then a sigh. "I figured you'd say that," the president said. "Just be careful. This isn't a battle we've seen before." Jasmine looked down at her unopened takeout. "No," she replied. "It's not a battle. It's a line in the sand." She hung up, turned to her legal folder, and began writing. She knew the courtroom wasn't just waiting for her presence. It was waiting to see if she would come crawling. She wasn't going to. She would come prepared, armed with the very Constitution they thought she'd never study close enough to use against them. The motorcade pulled up to the Supreme Court just before 8 a.m. Jasmine sat in the back seat, her tablet in one hand, coffee in the other, eyes focused but calm. Her driver glanced nervously in the rearview mirror, clearly unsure how to speak to someone heading into a place where laws end and legacy begins. Jasmine broke the silence first, offering him a wry smile. "If I don't come out in 3 hours," she said casually, "tell Maxine Waters to start a GoFundMe for my bail." He blinked, then let out a laugh, half genuine, half horrified. "You're joking, right?" She just raised an eyebrow. "Only kind of." The car slowed as they approached the entrance. Barricades were already in place. Protesters, reporters, and camera crews lined the sidewalk. Some cheered, others shouted, and Jasmine, in a navy blazer and white blouse, symbolic, intentional, stepped out into the chaos without a flinch. As the wind caught her curls, she squared her shoulders and turned to the stairs. "Let's do this." What struck her most wasn't the noise. It was the silence behind it, the quiet tension, the way people weren't just shouting anymore. They were watching, really watching. Members of Congress stood among the crowd, some in support, some just curious, most silent. She climbed the steps slowly, deliberately, each footstep echoing like a drum beat across the stone. She wasn't being escorted like a criminal. She wasn't invited like a guest. She was summoned like a warning. Inside the Supreme Court, the ceiling arched like a cathedral, the air colder than expected. The marble columns towered over her, flanking a room filled to capacity with journalists, legal scholars, political operatives, and ordinary citizens who had somehow made it inside. Jasmine moved with quiet poise past the front pews, past the armed bailiffs, and up toward the defense podium. Her footsteps echoed. The room fell into a hush. The chief clerk stood, voice firm. "This court is now in session. Justice Samuel Alito presiding." She turned slowly to face the bench. 9 chairs, 9 robes, 9 eyes, all watching. And then, the clerk's voice again, sharp and echoing like a verdict. "Ms. Jasmine Crockett, you stand accused of contempt of this court for statements made on April 3, 2025, during your official capacity as a representative of the United States Congress. Jasmine nodded once, not deferential, not defiant, simply present. She clasped her hands in front of her and took a steady breath. In the corner of the gallery, a law student gripped her notebook tightly. A political commentator whispered into his mic. "She's standing, alone, no lawyer." The symbolism was impossible to miss. A single black woman standing under 9 robed judges in a chamber designed by men who never imagined someone like her holding power. She knew the weight of it. She also knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. At the bench, Judge Alito leaned forward. His expression was unreadable, tight-lipped, composed, but his fingers tapped the wood in a rhythm that betrayed the tension he claimed to rise above. He stared directly at Jasmine before speaking, voice measured but sharp. "Congresswoman Crockett, your remarks following the decision in Fairfield versus Department of Education have drawn the court's concern. Specifically, your assertion that this court, quote, spit on 70 years of precedent. That is not criticism. That is contempt." He let the silence stretch before continuing. "You have 7 days to formally retract your statement and issue an apology. If you refuse, this court will proceed with a formal motion for criminal prosecution for contempt." The words landed like stone. A ripple moved through the room. Reporters sat up straighter. Lawyers turned in their seats. No one breathed. The weight of what had just been said was staggering. Not just a warning, but an open threat from the Supreme Court to a sitting member of Congress. And yet, Jasmine smiled, just slightly. It wasn't cocky. It wasn't naive. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing something others didn't. The kind of smile that said, "You brought me here thinking I'd beg, but I came here ready to fight." And that was the moment the courtroom shifted. No gavel strike could drown out what had just changed. The court expected submission, but Jasmine Crockett had brought something else entirely. She had brought truth, and she was just getting started. The courtroom was frozen. The words had been spoken. The ultimatum delivered. Judge Alito's gavel rested like a weapon beside him, and the weight of 9 robed justices hung heavy in the air. Most people would have broken under the pressure. Alito certainly expected silence, maybe a trembling voice, or a carefully crafted apology drafted by White House counsel. He expected compliance. He expected submission. What he did not expect was what happened next. Jasmine Crockett didn't move immediately. She didn't flinch or plead or stammer. She reached calmly, almost casually, into her leather briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with paper. She placed it on the podium, smoothed the cover with her hand, and looked directly at the bench. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I've prepared a constitutional analysis of the charges in question. May I present it to the court for consideration?" The silence snapped. The gallery stirred. A reporter near the back leaned forward so quickly his pen dropped. Camera lenses whirred into focus. A woman in the second row gasped audibly. On the bench, a few justices exchanged surprised glances. Alito's jaw tightened. "Proceed," he said curtly, though the tension in his voice betrayed how unprepared he was for this turn. Jasmine opened the folder slowly, with the poise of a professor and the clarity of a trial lawyer. "I'll begin," she said, "by addressing the court's own definition of contempt and how it intersects with First Amendment protections." Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't waver. She turned to the first page and spoke with deliberate precision. "As outlined in Bridges v. California, 314 U.S. 252, this court held that criticism of judicial decisions, even when sharp or emotional, is not contempt unless it poses a clear and present danger to the administration of justice." Jasmine paused just long enough for the name of the case to sink in. Her tone was steady, but everyone could feel the heat rising beneath it. "My statement did not interfere with a pending case, nor did it threaten a judge's safety or obstruct any court proceeding. It criticized reasoning, not authority. There is a legal difference." She turned the page. "In Craig v. Harney, 331 U.S. 367, the court further held that what transpires in the courtroom is public property. That judges must tolerate strong, even harsh criticism of their decisions. That the First Amendment does not bend for institutional ego. Justice Donnelly, who had been scanning her notes from the bench, slowly looked up. Her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in curiosity. Jasmine had cited two landmark cases within a minute, both directly relevant. She wasn't improvising. She had studied, prepared, armed herself with the very doctrines the court was built on, and she wasn't hiding behind vague principle. She was quoting the court's own rulings back at them. The gallery remained still, but you could feel something shifting. Jasmine flipped to page 4. In New York Times vs. Sullivan, this court wrote, "Debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. And that includes, Your Honors, criticism that is vehement, caustic, and sometimes unpleasantly sharp." She looked up. If the First Amendment doesn't protect strong words spoken by elected officials about public rulings, then it protects nothing. There it was, the first real tremor. She wasn't just defending herself. She was holding up a mirror to the very court that sought to silence her. And in doing so, she wasn't playing games with abstract theory. She was using their own words. Jasmine shifted her weight slightly and continued, "I want to draw special attention to Bridges versus California, because that ruling didn't just defend free speech in theory, it drew a line in the sand." She read directly from the case. The substantive evil must be extremely serious, and the degree of imminence extremely high before utterances can be punished. She raised her eyes to meet Alito's. There was no such evil here. There was no incitement, no danger, only dissent. At that moment, even Justice Donnelly leaned back slightly, her brow furrowed, not in disapproval but in thought. The court hadn't expected this. They had called her to heel, but instead she had walked in armed with scholarship, precedent, and an unnerving calm that was rapidly overtaking the entire chamber. Alito shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lips pressed into a line. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said tightly, "this proceeding is not a debate. This is a review of whether your statements amount to contempt of this institution." Jasmine didn't blink. "With respect, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady as stone, "that is precisely why I'm here. Because if the First Amendment doesn't allow a member of Congress to criticize a Supreme Court ruling, then the very foundation of checks and balances begins to crack." And in that moment, no one could deny it anymore. Jasmine Crockett was not being reckless. She was being precise. Brilliantly, legally, dangerously precise. The folder she carried wasn't just a defense. It was a challenge, one wrapped in facts, sealed in law, and delivered without apology. The pages turned like the ticking of a clock. Jasmine Crockett stood unwavering as she advanced through her prepared defense, each citation delivered with the force of someone who had not just studied the Constitution, but had lived under its shadow. "In New York Times versus Sullivan," she said, lifting her eyes toward the bench, "this court reaffirmed that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. That includes criticism of government officials, especially those with power, including judges." She let the statement breathe, then continued, flipping to her next citation. "In Craig versus Harney, the court held that what transpires in the courtroom is public property. The judges are not immune to scrutiny simply because they wear robes." A few brows furrowed, not in doubt but in recognition. This was familiar ground for them, and Jasmine was walking it with confidence. Her voice held no fear, no self-pity, just clarity. "And finally," she said, holding up the next sheet, "in Garrison versus Louisiana, the court protected speech that was critical of the judiciary itself. A district attorney who publicly called out judges for bias was defended under the First Amendment because, quote, speech concerning public affairs is more than self-expression, it is the essence of self-government." She paused. Her eyes locked on the room like a teacher surveying a classroom. "Judges don't get to hide from criticism," she said slowly. "Not in this country, not in a democracy." At that moment, it wasn't clear who held more command over the courtroom, Justice Alito in his elevated chair, or Jasmine Crockett at the podium below. The spell broke slightly when Justice Rivera leaned forward, her voice firm and low. "Ms. Crockett," she said, "do you understand the gravity of what you're doing here today? You're not just defending your remarks. You're challenging the legitimacy of this institution? Jasmine didn't flinch. She nodded once, then answered without hesitation. And do you understand the gravity of silencing an elected voice of the people? The question rang out louder than it should have, echoing off marble columns and stone walls. Rivera's lips tightened, but she said nothing more. Jasmine pressed forward. I was elected to speak on behalf of my constituents. When this court makes a ruling that affects every classroom in the country, I have not only a right, but a duty to respond. To be silenced for that would not just punish me, it would punish democracy itself. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the exchange settled like dust on the floor. It wasn't just an argument anymore. It was a confrontation between two worlds, one that guarded tradition with locked doors and one that demanded those doors open. The courtroom had been designed to intimidate, to quiet those who entered with fire in their belly. But Jasmine was proving that fire could burn even in silence, and that resistance, when grounded in law, didn't have to shout to be deafening. Somewhere in the second row, a man in a gray suit leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "She's doing what no one's dared." That was the moment the shift became visible. Reporters, who had up until now been furiously typing, began to pause. Not because they had lost interest, but because they were stunned. What Jasmine was doing wasn't just rare, it was historic. Not since the 1960s had anyone spoken to the court this way, and certainly not a sitting black congresswoman, standing alone and unprotected in front of 9 of the most powerful legal minds in the nation. Law students clutched their notebooks tighter. A court sketch artist froze mid-stroke, unsure whether to capture the justice's expressions or Jasmine's firelit posture. The energy in the room had transformed. What had begun as a disciplinary proceeding was now a masterclass, a constitutional clinic delivered by a woman who had refused to stay in the box carved out for her. And though she stood on the lowest step of the court structure, beneath the high bench, beneath the carved words, "Equal justice under law," for the first time, many inside the room realized she wasn't beneath them at all. She was beside them, challenging them, matching them, and in more ways than one, outshining them. By now, Jasmine Crockett had moved through nearly all 15 pages of her analysis. Her words, sharp but measured, had pulled back the curtain on the court's authority and laid bare the tension between democratic voice and judicial insulation. Judge Alito, visibly agitated, shifted in his seat. His posture, which had remained confidently rigid until now, began to slip. He tapped his pen twice, then leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is not a debate, Ms. Crockett," he said tightly. "This proceeding is not your stage." Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She simply turned one more page and responded, "With respect, Your Honor, I am not debating. I am defending." Under Landmark Communications versus Virginia, this court ruled that injury to institutional reputation does not justify restricting speech that is otherwise protected. She let that sink in before continuing. That ruling reminded us that the press, and by extension, public officials, cannot be silenced simply because their words make institutions uncomfortable. Alito blinked slowly. He had expected resistance, yes, but not a case-by-case dismantling of his position. Not the systematic courtroom-quiet defiance of a woman who had not only come prepared, but had come to remind the court of its own words. She wasn't grandstanding. She was building an argument, precedent by precedent, brick by brick, and every brick had been laid by the court itself. That's what made it so dangerous. She wasn't challenging the law. She was the law, speaking it fluently, unapologetically, and directly into the face of one of its highest enforcers. Jasmine paused after the final case citation, and for the first time she didn't look down at her papers. She looked straight at Judge Alito, not with arrogance, not even with anger, with something far more piercing, truth. Her voice was calm, but the tone had changed, softer, more deliberate, and suddenly heavier. "Respect," she said, "is earned, not demanded by robe and gavel." The words came gently, like a teacher reminding a child of a lesson they already knew. But in that room, the effect was seismic. She continued, eyes still locked on Alito's. "I respect the court, I do, but that respect is not blind. It is not silent, and it is not unshakable when precedent is broken and millions are affected. You could hear a pin drop. The weight of the statement wasn't just legal, it was moral. And no robe, no bench, no institutional title could shield anyone from the truth of what had just been said. Her line didn't need to be shouted. It didn't need applause. It only needed ears. And now every ear in the chamber was listening. The effect was instant. Even Chief Justice Halstead, who had remained stone-faced throughout, leaned forward slightly as if trying to hear her better, or perhaps to simply witness it up close. Justice Donnelly lowered her pen. Justice Rivera turned subtly toward Alito. The clerk at the edge of the bench stopped taking notes entirely, and then, as if the room itself had slowed time, Judge Alito opened his mouth and for the first time faltered. "The court will need time to review," he said, the sentence landing somewhere between formality and retreat. His voice lacked its earlier force. The authority had not vanished, but it had cracked. And in that crack, the truth had poured through. The silence that followed was heavy, electric, alive with implication. Jasmine remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed the folder in front of her and stepped back from the podium. The gallery remained frozen. And then one murmur, then another. It spread like wind across tall grass, spectators whispering, reporters blinking in disbelief. Cameras flashing to catch the moment a sitting judge, one of the most powerful in the nation, had been brought to a pause by a single voice, a voice that had refused to beg, refused to flinch, refused to be anything less than righteous. And somewhere in the stillness of that moment, it became clear. This wasn't just a procedural hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. The doors to the Supreme Court opened, and Jasmine Crockett stepped into the corridor not as a defendant, not even as a congresswoman, but as a woman who had just stood alone and turned the highest court in the nation into a place of reckoning. The hallway outside erupted instantly. Dozens of microphones lunged toward her like a tidal wave of voices, questions, flashes, and gasps. "Congresswoman, do you regret your comments? Are you afraid of jail time? Did the court just blink?" She didn't stop. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Her aides scrambled to keep pace, shielding her from the chaos. One young staffer, barely out of law school, shook his head in disbelief and muttered under his breath, "We were gonna ask her to apologize. She never even told us she wrote that." Another aide, eyes wide, whispered, "We had a full apology draft in her binder. She never opened it." The truth settled in. She hadn't just defied the court. She had defied everyone's expectations, even those closest to her. By the time Jasmine reached the elevator, her phone had buzzed 7 times. Calls from Capitol Hill, from journalists, from civil rights organizations, from the president's office. Her face remained unreadable, but inside she felt the ground shifting. The performance was over, but the consequences, whatever they were, had only just begun. Within an hour, cable news was in overdrive. CNN replayed clips of the hearing with the headline, "Crockett vs. Court, Who Won?" One legal expert called her appearance a master class in First Amendment law, while another said it was the most precise dismantling of judicial overreach I've seen in decades. On MSNBC, a panel debated whether the court had overstepped in summoning a sitting member of Congress. On Fox News, the tone was starkly different. "This wasn't courage," said one anchor. "It was an attack on judicial authority, an elected official trying to bully the court." The split was immediate and wide, but what no one could ignore was this. Jasmine Crockett had become the most talked about name in America. Twitter trended with hashtag Crockett v. Court and hashtag contempt or courage. Law professors from Harvard to Howard issued open letters dissecting her citations. TikTok exploded with clips of her saying, "Respect is earned, not demanded by robe and gavel." Young women, especially Black law students, posted videos tearing up as they watched her speak truth to power without ever raising her voice. The headlines weren't just political, they were personal. One voice in the chamber. She made the Constitution her shield. From contempt charges to constitutional hero, the legal world had rarely seen anything like it. A congressional woman of color turning a courtroom designed to judge her into a classroom where she delivered the lesson. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the 9 justices met in a conference room sealed from the public. They removed their robes, sat down with tea and papers, and spoke without pretense. Chief Justice Halstead cleared his throat. "She cited us correctly," he said. "Every ruling, page number, footnote." Justice Rivera remained silent for a moment, then finally said, "She used our own rulings against us." No one disagreed, not even Alito, who sat with his arms crossed, staring at the wall. "She was disrespectful," he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Justice Donnelly leaned forward, hands clasped. "She was direct, not disrespectful. There's a difference." Another justice chimed in. "I don't agree with her conclusions, but I can't say she was wrong on the law." There it was, the quiet admission that spoke louder than any ruling. They hadn't been challenged like this in years. Not by someone inside the system, not by someone who came with nothing but her own mind and a folder of arguments built from the very Constitution they swore to uphold. And as the conversation continued, something became clear among them. Not agreement with Jasmine's politics, perhaps not even her message, but a growing, undeniable respect for how she had delivered it. Jasmine sat on her couch, shoes still on, the chaos of the day finally fading into the kind of stillness only the late night brings. Her phone buzzed endlessly, calls, messages, emails stacked like dominoes, but for the first time in hours she ignored them. Instead, she reached into her purse looking for her charger, and her fingers brushed across something unfamiliar. A folded envelope, yellowed at the edges. Her heart skipped. She pulled it out slowly, staring at the handwriting. Her father's. It had been years since she last saw it. Years since he'd passed. He had been a civil rights lawyer in Texas, fierce and principled, a man who taught her how to argue not to win, but to protect. She unfolded the letter, hands trembling just a little, and began to read. "My dearest Jasmine," it began, "if you're reading this, it means you're standing in a fight I may never see. And I want you to remember this. Speak, even when they say silence is safer. Speak, even when the room grows cold, because silence has never protected us. Not once, not ever. The law is powerful, but truth is braver." She wiped a tear before it could fall and let the rest of the letter rest on her lap. He hadn't written it for this moment, but somehow it was written for exactly this moment. The next morning, the court released its official statement. It was terse, dry, and characteristically cold, crafted not to escalate, but certainly not to retreat. Judge Alito's words were precise. "This court maintains its authority to preserve institutional integrity. We decline at this time to pursue further contempt proceedings, though we continue to caution against rhetoric that endangers judicial independence." It landed as expected, defensive, stiff, and lacking soul. But then another statement followed. Justice Rivera released a rare concurring opinion, published independently through the court's press office. Her words, though measured, carried weight. "The First Amendment does not weaken this court. It proves it still matters. Our authority does not come from insulation, but from the willingness to be examined, even criticized, by the people we serve." Ms. Crockett reminded us of that. The statement trended within hours. For the first time in decades, the public saw justice not cloaked in distance, but in humility. By noon, Jasmine's speech had gone viral. A clip of her saying respect is earned, not demanded by robe and gavel, crossed 10 million views. Young law students from UCLA to Spelman posted photos of her with captions like "Our North Star" and "She brought a folder and left with history." A mural of her began on a brick wall in Detroit. An elementary school in Baltimore held an assembly just to replay her defense for students. And when Howard University announced it would host her for a guest lecture titled "The Constitution and Courage," tickets sold out in under 2 minutes. Across America, Black women, mothers, professors, activists, daughters, shared stories. One woman posted, "She didn't just defend herself, she defended us all." Another wrote, For the first time, my 13-year-old daughter said she wants to be a lawyer. Thank you, Jasmine Crockett. And Jasmine, still sitting quietly on her couch, scrolled through those messages one by one, overwhelmed not by fame, but by the weight of what had shifted. She had gone into that courtroom carrying a folder. She left carrying something bigger, a movement. In a world where silence is often safer, true courage is the willingness to speak up, even when the cost is high. Jasmine Crockett's story teaches us that standing for truth may not always bring applause. Sometimes it brings risk, judgment, even threats. But the value of a voice doesn't come from how loudly it is heard. It comes from how honestly and bravely it is used. When you stand firm with principle, not ego, when you defend what is right even when you're alone, you create space for others to stand too. Jasmine didn't just defend herself. She modeled a kind of dignity that inspires future generations to rise with clarity, wisdom, and strength. Whether in a courtroom, a classroom, a family, or a quiet moment of injustice, this story reminds us, integrity is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of it. And when you choose to speak, not to attack, but to protect what matters most, you leave behind something greater than victory. You leave behind change. This story is a work of fiction. The characters, including Jasmine Crockett and Samuel Alito, are entirely fictional and do not represent or depict any real individuals, public figures, or events. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. The narrative is intended for storytelling and entertainment purposes only. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more powerful, emotional, and thought-provoking tales, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Your support helps me continue creating stories that inspire, challenge, and move hearts. Click subscribe and join our growing community of thoughtful viewers. Together, let's keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching.